Welcome to part 2 of the narrated PowerPoint for Chapter 11, focusing on making decisions. In this part, I'm going to be focusing on just a couple of major ideas, the first of which is faulty decision making. All of us are prone to falling into a whole host of decision making traps. You might wonder, is there anything we can do about it besides sort of learning about this stuff? The answer is yes. What we can do in order to avoid falling into these decision-making traps is to engage in critical thinking and to base our decisions on evidence that comes from credible sources that we've vetted, that we've considered carefully, that we've judged in contrast to our principles and values, and that we've confirmed with other people makes sense. So let's just dive in, shall we? Oh, excuse me. I have to let my cat out of my office. He's got business. Just a sec. There you go. There you go, Gary. Thanks. Naturally, he decided he had to leave. Sorry about that. Naturally, he decided he had to leave right in the middle of a recording. God bless him. All right, so let's dive into these decision-making traps. The first of which is anchoring and adjustment bias. This refers to our tendency to rely too heavily on arbitrary numbers, irrelevant traits, or facts. Instead of actual value, we get anchored, we get hung up on numbers that aren't, in fact, important or that don't necessarily reflect true value. Illustratively, we're bartering for something, we're trying to negotiate, and the other party says, oh, that's going to be X amount, and we get hung up on that number instead of thinking about what we actually think that object might be worth. Availability bias refers to a situation in which information that is more readily available is seen as more likely to occur, despite what the reality may be. The text gives the example of you purchase a white car, and all of a sudden you notice, my gosh, there are white cars. We tend to notice the things that we have heard about. We tend to think that, oh, those must be much more common than perhaps they really are. Escalation of commitment bias. This is one of my favorites. This has to do basically with people not understanding what sunk costs are. People not understanding that just because you've invested a lot of time in something, that alone is not a reason to continue along a particular path. My favorite example, I knew a couple when I was an undergraduate in college, nice people, each of them. They would be together, and then they would break up, and then they would be together, and then they would break up. And this sort of went back and forth, back and forth. And finally, at one point, I said to one of the two, I said, why do you keep getting together? I was just curious. And the response was, I've invested so much time into this relationship. Well, investing time in a relationship by itself isn't a reason to keep trying. If it's not going to work out, it's not going to work out, no matter how much time in the past you've put into it or how much money you've spent on a project. If it turns out that it's really not the best way forward, one has to know when to let go. Fundamental attribution error you've heard about. We talked about this at the end of the first chapter, all those many weeks ago, chapter 3. This is where we act as though positive outcomes come from our personal characteristics, while negative outcomes come from things outside of us. So you do really well on an exam, it's because you're smart. You do poorly on an exam, it's because the teacher's a terrible teacher. If you really believe when you do poorly that it's because the teacher's a terrible teacher, well then when you do well, accordingly, you should be giving positive credit to the teacher, right? Likewise, if you believe when you do well that that's because of what you've done, well, then when you don't do so well, you should also accept that you probably had something to do with that. Hindsight bias occurs when we look backward in time and we say things like this: "Oh, I should have known," or "Of course we should have known." Current example happening right now as people are thinking about, what are the next steps with respect to this novel coronavirus? What should we be doing now in terms of quarantining? Well, I'm hearing lots of people talking about how we should have done X back in January or even December. And we should have known that it would make sense to do that back in January. Well, the reality is we didn't know. We didn't have all of the information that we have now. We also didn't have the learning that we have acquired between January and now. We couldn't have possibly made a different decision than we did, really, most likely, anyway. Certainly not in the sense that some people would like, where, well, it's obvious. No, it's hardly ever obvious. We move into one of my favorites, which is the mix-up between correlation and causation. You know what correlation is. This is when two variables tend to move together. They are co-related. Either when one goes up, the other one goes up, or when one goes up, the other one goes down, or when one goes down, the other one goes up. There's some kind of relationship, or at least there appears to be a relationship. But that correlation does not, in and of itself, imply causation. In order to say that one causes the other, we have to know that one happened before the other. I studied and then I did well on the exam. We can say that studying probably causes performance on an exam because we know that one precedes, but it's very typical for us to make assumptions about variables that are correlated as if one was the cause for the other. Let me walk you through a few spurious correlations so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. So take a look at this figure. What do you notice? Well, we have per capita cheese consumption as it relates, or seems to relate, to the number of people who died becoming their bed sheets. Look at that graph. Look at that. Somebody who didn't know any better, somebody who didn't understand correlation versus causation, might conclude that the more cheese you eat, the greater the likelihood that you will die by becoming tangled in your bed sheets. What a terrifying thought, especially if you live in Wisconsin, where, let's face it, we love our cheese, right? This is a spurious correlation. One does not have anything to do with the other. It just so happens that if you plot them together, it looks like they're correlated. They are correlated, but one does not cause the other. Let's do another example. Letters in the winning word of the Scripps National Spelling Bee. You know, this is the annual thing, happens every year, where these younger kids get up and they spell words that nobody uses, or at least hardly anybody uses, right? How many letters in that winning word, that final word, as correlated with the number of people killed by venomous spiders? Look at this. Holy mackerel, over 10 years, 1999 to 2009, these things go hand in hand. They're correlated, pretty high degree of correlation, actually. But does one cause the other? No. It's silly, right? Another example. The divorce rate in Maine versus the per capita or per person consumption of margarine. Look at this. Holy camoles. Once again, we see this relationship where it appears that the more margarine you have, the higher the likelihood that you'll end up divorced, at least if you live in Maine. Well, the correlation is real. It's there. But does it mean anything? No, of course not. It's silly. One does not cause the other. Something else that relates to each of these, that's what makes it look like these two things are somehow related to one another. But in truth, how much margarine a person eats does not dictate the likelihood of them getting divorced in Maine or anywhere. Another spurious correlation. Total revenue generated by arcades, where video games are, pinball machines, up against computer science doctorates awarded in the United States. What does this tell you? Well, these two things are correlated. That's definitely going on there, right? But does one cause the other? No. The fact that more people are playing more video games, spending more of their money in arcades, has nothing to do with the fact that there are more computer science doctorates being awarded. Now, here's a very current and interesting map for you to look at. The top shows you at a given point in time where the COVID-19 cases were centered in the United States. The bottom shows you where 5G cell towers are located in the United States. What do you notice? Well, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you might, making the mistake of confusing correlation for causation, you might conclude that there's no such thing as a coronavirus, but rather the thing responsible for the illness we call COVID-19 is 5G cell towers. Because look, wherever there are more 5G cell towers, there are more cases of COVID-19. Okay. Is it really the case that 5G cell towers are causing COVID-19? No. This is where your critical thinking comes into play. What else might account for what these maps look like? I'll give you a second to think about that. It's actually pretty simple. What's going on, what you're seeing in both of these maps, you're seeing where population density is different. In the upper northeast part of the country, New York City, etc., lots of people living there. Lots of 5G cell towers. Over in the upper northwest, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, lots of people living there. More 5G cell towers. Down in the San Francisco and Los Angeles area, again, more people, more 5G cell towers. Also, more people with COVID-19 because more people, as opposed to Montana or, say, Wyoming, which has something like 500,000 people, whereas the state of Wisconsin has right around 5 million. Okay? Again, what these two maps are showing you is not that 5G cell towers cause COVID-19. That's ridiculous. It's a virus. Trust me, it really is. 5G cell towers might be responsible for something else, but they're not responsible for COVID-19. We have to be careful to not confuse correlation and causation. More decision-making traps. Overconfidence bias occurs when individuals overestimate their ability to predict the future. I'm always able to guess what a baby's gender will be. I always get right who will win the Super Bowl. I always fill in the blank, okay? That's overconfidence bias. Framing bias has to do with our tendency to be influenced by the way that a situation or problem is presented. So you've seen examples of people trying to frame things around this coronavirus differently, where some people want to talk about the percentage of people who have not been found ill versus the percentage of people who have been found ill. The percentage of people who, once they've contracted the virus, have died versus the percentage of people who have not died. What's the right way to think about this? Some people will tell you we should take a more positive spin. Something like 98% of the people who've gotten this have not died. or whatever the percentage is when you're paying attention to this narrated PowerPoint. This seems like a pretty high percentage, right? And people say, well, that's a more positive, that's a more appropriate way to think about this. Except when you consider real numbers, which is what you need to do in order to get away from framing bias, real numbers tell you that even 2%, even 1% of 330 million people, that's the population of the United States, that's a lot of people, okay? And every single one of those people was important to somebody, to lots of somebodies. So while framing may help us to think about something more positively or negatively, we need to be careful that we're also thinking about realities like actual numbers and not percentages, however they might be framed. Finally, on this side, satisficing. We've already talked about this in part 1 of this narrated PowerPoint. Satisficing is what we do when we take the first best alternative. Instead of trying to optimize our decision, we just go after the first thing that seems okay. And that can be problematic, especially if we've really just allocated no time to the process, no time to thinking about our decision. We just want to quick make a decision. I'll just take the first thing that seems to be okay. Well, sometimes it makes a whole lot more sense to take just a wee bit more time so that we can make a better decision. That brings us to the second major topic of this part 2, which is decision making in groups. So when it comes to decision making, are 2 heads better than 1? Should we have groups make the decision or individuals? Well, on the individual side, the pros include individuals can make decisions faster than groups can. It's often the case that even in a group of people, there will be one person who frankly has more expertise, let's say, who could make a better decision than the group as a whole. Also, when it's one person making a decision, it's pretty easy to determine accountability. So we know who to blame if a bad decision has been made, and we know who to celebrate if a good decision has been made. On the con side, with respect to individuals, any given individual is likely to generate fewer ideas than a group would. Trying to figure out who that best, smartest, most expert individual in a group, that can be tough. And an individual might be able to put off decisions if they're left alone. In other words, if nobody's sort of keeping track of them because they're not part of a group, well, they might put off making a decision for perhaps too long. In terms of group decision making, the pros, you get way more ideas, right? Lots more diversity. People can piggyback on each other's ideas. People tend to be more committed to those ideas, those decisions once they're made, and the interaction, frankly, can be fun and serve as a team building task. With respect to cons, it takes longer. Whenever you ask a group of people to make a decision, it's going to take longer than if just one person had made that decision. Another serious problem is groupthink, which we touched on very briefly when we talked about teams, and I'm going to discuss it in more depth in just a bit. But these are bad things that can happen whenever we find ourselves working with others. And then the last, social loafing, can become more of a problem. It can be harder to identify who's responsible for a decision, and therefore harder to know who to blame or who to celebrate. As I mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about groupthink. I'm going to use the example of the Space Shuttle Challenger. January 28th, 1986, I was in Mexico as an undergraduate when this happened. The Space Shuttle Challenger launched, and within moments, it exploded, killing all of the astronauts, those people that you see in the photo. All of the astronauts were killed. One of the astronauts, her name was Krista McAuliffe. She's the woman in the back, second from the left as you're looking at the photo with the lighter colored hair. She was a school teacher, and she, unlike the rest of the astronauts, was a regular person who had been selected to participate in this mission because at this point, NASA felt as though it really had down what space travel meant. They felt like they were the experts. And so Krista McAuliffe was chosen from a lot of potential applicants, a lot of potential candidates, to be this school teacher who was going to teach from space. That morning, when the Challenger launched, there were school children across the United States glued to their televisions in their classrooms, watching as the shuttle launched and then as the shuttle exploded. You can imagine how traumatizing this was, not only for those school children, but of course for everyone. Well, let's talk about groupthink. What led to this outcome? Could it have been possible to avoid it? Well, what happens in groupthink, essentially, is that the group makes a or many poor decisions for a variety of reasons that have to do with group dynamics. So again, groupthink is a bad thing. It's not a good thing. We're not talking about a group reaching a positive consensus. We're talking about a group reaching a negative consensus. So I'm going to talk through each of these symptoms and relate them back to the Challenger example. The night before the launch, there was a teleconference in which people at more than one site participated, led by NASA personnel. The conference was being held to decide, when I say conference, I mean meeting. So this was a meeting. The conference was being held to decide whether the launch should go forward. It had already been postponed once. Postponing the launch again would be costly. People wanted to know, should the launch go ahead? The people participating in the call, who ultimately engage in groupthink, and that's what leads to what happens the next day, the explosion and the fatalities. The people participating from NASA really believed in this illusion of invulnerability. They saw themselves as the best and the brightest. NASA, as you may or may not know, is filled with PhDs, some of the smartest people on the planet. They assuredly are. There's no question about that. And they saw themselves as, we're number one. We're the smartest of the smart. We couldn't possibly make a mistake. As a result, when they heard from two engineers from Morton Thiokol that they believed that there would be a problem with the O-rings given the expected temperature for the next morning's launch, that intel, that intelligence, was dismissed, collectively rationalized. That can't be right. That can't possibly be right. It's wrong. You can't prove that with the temperatures that are expected in the morning, it will be too low for the O-rings, and that's what was being discussed here, for the O-rings to seal properly. You can't prove it. Your intel is wrong. We're smarter than you. The NASA folks also had this unquestioned belief in their own morality. They believed that they knew what was best for everyone involved, that if asked to explain their reasoning from an ethical standpoint, that their morality would be, in fact, unquestionable. Stereotyping of outgroups. The insistence was that these engineers from Morton Thiokol, they didn't know what the NASA people knew. They didn't know. They were clueless. The information they were sharing was irrelevant. The person who was leading the teleconference directly applied pressure, insisted that the two engineers from Morton Thiokol could not be right, that their data did not reveal what they said it revealed, that they were out on a limb, that somehow they were just opposed to this launch for reasons that had nothing to do with facts. You can imagine the impact. Well, after basically being beaten down by the leader of the teleconference and others, those two engineers eventually just stopped talking. They self-censored. They may have been thinking to themselves, maybe I'm wrong in what I think I'm seeing. Maybe I'm not interpreting this data correctly. Interestingly, you can read transcripts of this meeting, and you can read what those two engineers from Morton Thiokol thought at the time and in the aftermath. And you're going to see all of these symptoms of groupthink as you read that transcript. As the end of the teleconference neared, and the leaders said, well, are we all on the same page? By then, people had given up trying to argue. The two engineers from Morton Thiokol could see no one wanted to hear what they had to say, so they didn't say anything else. And the leader concluded, because no one was saying anything else, that, well, it's unanimous then. We're all on the same page. Self-appointed mind guards has to do with this. We don't need to tell anybody else about this counterintelligence that was shared. It's not really relevant. We don't need to share that with anybody higher up. All we need to share our decision that things are fine and that it's okay to go ahead with this launch. And that's exactly what happened. Basically, a classic case of groupthink that led to catastrophic consequences, not only for those 7 engineers, but for the space program in general, and a pretty significant blow to NASA's reputation. It would take years for them to recover from this. So what can be done to try and avoid groupthink? There are 2 that out of this whole slide that I want to highlight. The first is assigning someone to play the role of devil's advocate. What that means is this person, the devil's advocate, is intentionally charged with trying to figure out where the group might be making mistakes in terms of its critical thinking, pointing out potential errors, identifying potential biases, highlighting when the group starts to slip into those symptoms of groupthink that I just discussed. That's that person's role. And everybody understands it, so they don't take it personally when the person, the devil's advocate, might indicate, ooh, I think we need to take a step back. The other one that I want to point out is down below under group leaders, where we talk about the third bullet, having the leader remain impartial and refrain from stating preferences at the outset. In that NASA teleconference, again, if you read the transcript, you'll notice that the leader of that speaks up pretty early and makes it clear that he wants this launch to happen. Well, when leaders do things like that, that pretty well can shut down a group's followers from sharing any sort of counterintelligence. And what we saw in that particular example was that even when people had pretty good counterintelligence, information saying, yeah, I don't think we should be launching, because the leader had already made clear his preference, it was very hard for those 2 engineers to get any traction. What can we do in groups to make better decisions? Well, I'll highlight just a couple here. You can read this over carefully, and the text does a terrific job of describing it in further detail. 1, the nominal group technique. Basically, you have something that you want the group to participate in making a decision about. You ask everyone to write down their ideas. You go one by one, and you have everybody share their ideas, write those ideas so that everyone can see those ideas until everyone's ideas are exhausted, they've all been shared, and then have the group discuss all of those ideas and make a collective decision. Key here is ensuring that everyone participates, not just the people who are most comfortable sharing their ideas, not just the people who usually talk, but everybody. The reality is, the folks who are quieter in a group often have some of the best ideas. They just may need to be coaxed to share those ideas. The other one I want to talk about is consensus. To make clear that consensus isn't about everyone being 100% fired up about a decision, but rather it's the state where people say, I'm mostly okay with this. I'm okay enough with this decision. I will support this decision as it goes forward. Even though I may still have some questions or issues with it, I will fundamentally support this decision. When you have everyone in a group saying at least that, you can say that you have achieved a consensus. Now, that's not the same as not giving people a chance to talk and saying, well, looks like we're all on the same page then, without having even specifically asked everyone to share their thoughts. Are you with me? You see the difference? Consensus, you're actually asking everyone to share their thoughts and seeing if, for the most part, they can commit to a particular decision, even though they may still have some reservations. That's quite different from looking around a table full of people or a room full of people and saying, well, I don't see any other hands up, so that I guess that means that we're all on the same page. Okay, and we're done, right? Quite different. Again, the others, what you see here on this slide, pretty straightforward stuff. The text explains them in a bit more detail. Ooh, and that brings us to our final slide, our final slide. This is the final slide of our final narrated PowerPoint. Thanks for hanging in there through all of this course's topics. I really appreciate it. Ciao.